Hello, welcome to the Westminster Standard Podcast. I'm Ryan Beasy. Today we are celebrating and remembering the life, the legacy of PCA founding father Dr. Morton Smith on this, the centenary of his birth. And so I have with me four other brothers who have either studied extensively the life and the writings of Dr. Smith or studied under him or served on the faculty with him. So why don't we start with Roland and introduce yourselves, brothers?
I am Roland Matthews, a pastor in the PCA, Southwest Virginia, and Drapers Valley Presbyterian Church, among other things.
And Dr. Wilborn?
Oh, yes, Nick Wilborn, pastor at Covenant Presbyterian Church in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and sometimes teaching at Greenville Seminary and Puritan Reformed Seminary. And yeah, that's enough for now.
And on the faculty with Dr. Smith for a season, correct?
For several years, yeah.
Yes. And on the bottom, two Zachs. Found the firm
That's
foundation
right.
there.
Are we going clockwise or what? Like, which one of us goes first?
You're talking.
Go ahead,
Go
Go ahead, Zach.
All right. Well, I'm Zach Groff. I'm the pastor of Antioch Presbyterian Church in Woodruff, South Carolina, between Greenville and Spartanburg. I'm a graduate of Greenville Seminary. I was never a student of Dr. Smith's except by reading his books, but Dr. Wilborn and I did visit with Dr. Smith for several hours in August of 2017 before Dr. Smith's stroke. So I did have the pleasure of making his acquaintance and getting to know him a bit in my role as Director of Advancement and Admissions at Greenville Seminary in 2017 before Dr. Smith passed away. And he was a dear man, and really glad that I had the opportunity, and I thank Dr. Wilborn for that, had the opportunity to visit in person with one of the preeminent founding fathers of our denomination.
I'm Zachary Garris, pastor of Bryce Avenue Presbyterian Church out in White Rock, New Mexico. I never got to meet Dr. Smith in person, but I've read a lot of his works and benefited from his writings and teachings. My church actually did have him out. I think a couple times. We have some of his videos available on our church website. I also graduated RTS Jackson, where he first taught, as did Beasy. So, yeah.
I should circle back, BZ, and just note that I was a student of Dr. Smith. I started in 2002. He was already in his 80s, early 80s, and he taught several of the systematics courses that I was able to take with him at Greenville. So there's that and other things that I'm sure we'll talk about later.
Indeed. Well, Dr. Wilborn, would you give us
I know
just
Zach's
a
looking
brief,
up at me.
a brief biographical sketch of Dr. Smith?
Sure, yeah. I was just asked to do this about 5 minutes ago, so this is on the fly. But I understand the whole thing is on the fly, so we'll try to fly as well as we can here. Dr. Smith was a Virginian, and if you ever met him, and I know there's still a number of folks older than I who knew him and had him as student at RTS. When it was first started, they would motion that he was a Virginian, and he was always a Virginian, even though he lived the latter part of his life in North Carolina in the mountains. He was a Virginian, and before I get into some life things of his, one of the great pleasures I had was taking a little trip with him up the Virginia Valley to Lexington and then on up to Farmville, where where Hampden, Sydney is, and going out in the countryside there, and he was able to remember enough of those roads out there to where we found the old Buffalo Church and the Bird and the Cub Creek Church, and then trekked on to Richmond and went out to Pole Green, where Samuel Davies' ministry was sort of hubbed, and then around town, and spending those were quite a delight. One of my highlights of my history with him. But born in Virginia, he's remarkable heritage. If I remember correctly, and as Zach said earlier, the Zach that keeps looking upward to the heavens, no doubt. If I remember correctly, I know that his family was in the line of General Robert E. Lee, and if I'm not mistaken, also George Washington's family line as well. And so, very a godly family. His father and mother. He grew up a covenant child, and went off to the University of Michigan after his high school days, and earned a degree there in
Forestry.
but I think you're right.
It was
I think horticulture
I
first
think it was
because
forestry.
oldest son, but it was there he met his wife to be, Miss Lewis, and she always reminded him that she was not a Southerner, and that's okay. She became a good honorary Southerner after many years. And I'll tell you a sweet little story. Don't remind me. The word is malaise. Just remember malaise, and I'll tell you a little cute story in a few moments about those two. But after Michigan, he he was in the Air Force, and was a pilot, and ended up never getting to go overseas, but trained pilots in Arkansas, and spent his life doing that, and then flew, in fact, all the way through his years as stated clerk of the PCA, those first 15 years. Living in Brevard, he would fly his own plane to Presbyterian meetings, and all over the country, really. With Presbyterian were considering PCA, what should they do? Individual churches considering leaving their affiliation with the PCA, and that's how he traveled around a good deal of his time as stated clerk on those longer trips, and then to seminary. Went to Columbia Theological Seminary. Was attracted to particularly one faculty member, Dr. William Childs Robinson, and you meet students of Dr. Robinson, and they all affectionately called him Dr. Robbie. He was the last. I think it's not really debatable. He was the last of the old school at Columbia Seminary, retiring in the late 1960s. And he became concerned about the neo-Orthodox, also in the faculty at that time there, as well as just broad evangelicalism. And took a year, went up to Westminster Theological Seminary, and there studied with the men who were there at that time. Professor John Murray and E.J. Young and Cornelius Van Til. And he was always fond of telling me of Van Til counseling him to go back to Columbia because he asked him, "What do you want to do when you finish seminary?" He said, I want to be a minister in the Southern Church." And he said, "Well, then you should go back to seminary and church or influence, have more inside connections to be able to make the kind of contribution that church needs." So he took that advice from Van Til and went back down to Columbia and finished his degree there. Went off from Columbia with Miss Lois in tow to Amsterdam and studied at the Free College there under G.C. Berkouwer. And many of those listening, watching whatever's happening tonight as we fly along here at a rather low level. He got over there and studied with Berkouwer, and a lot of folks will know Berkouwer and be familiar with his historical / systematical theology set that he wrote, along with a number of other monographs. And so he was his advisor and primary reader for his PhD work, his dissertation, which Berkouwer actually encouraged him to do concerning the Southern Presbyterian theologians. And so that's what he did his PhD dissertation on, and earned himself a PhD there at that. Came back to the States, some pastoral work, taught variously, landed at Belhaven College, and was there with some pretty impressive folks. He was actually on the faculty when Belhaven moved from being a women's institution only to being coeducational. And among some of those first students that came in were someone that Zach's working with now, Dr. Joey Pipa, and my friends down in Mississippi, Bebo Elkin and some of those men were among some of the first to come into Belhaven and in those days, and then on to RTS when Dr. Smith was drafted in to be part of that founding of the institute originally, and then the seminary in 1966. Their founding of RTS then was part of the continuing church movement, and in the Southern Church, the PCUS. And then when the PCA is started, and of course you can't without saying instrumental to the beginning of the PCA was Dr. Smith, along with Don Patterson and it goes on in Simpson and Bob Canada, and you just rattle on with names, period. But Dr. Smith's research and work on behalf of the concerned Presbyterians was very instrumental in helping the church at large to understand exactly what in their church. You know, I was just hearing today someone talk about our nation and the political scene, and how that in the history of the world, and I don't know enough about this to argue for or against what this historian said, but to be, as she said it, it sounded not only plausible but most. She said this, that no country has slipped in leadership without first having a shift to an authoritarian leader, and authoritarians tend to get a foothold in countries because countries, the mass of the people, tend to think that will never happen to us. We would never end up there. I bring that up because I think that's where the PCUS was in the 1960s, 50s certainly, 40s, 50s, 60s, and we even hear it. And I'm not equating. Don't take me wrongly here. I'm not equating the PCA today with the PCUS back then, but we hear it occasionally in Presbyterian, even General Assembly, when something's brought up and concern is raised, and they say, "Oh, but we would never do that. We would never let that happen again." Like, well, that's what they said in the 40s and the 50s in the PCUS. And this historian today that I was listening to was saying that about nations that drift into authoritarian rule, and then that lands them in dictatorships. That people are saying, "Oh no, we won't go there. We can weather this storm. He'll pass. This leader will pass. She will pass. We'll be back to where we were," and then it never happens. They never go back. So Dr. Smith's book largely served that for the founders of the PCA, was to show them that this is really what has happened. This is how far we've drifted, and we've lost our ability to act judicially, to deal with doctrinal and aberrations. And so Dr. Smith, just if How the Gold Has Become Dim was his only contribution, it would have been seminal to the founding of the PCA. And there again, yeah. 2 copies? No, I thought Zach Groff was about to pick one up too.
The only thing I don't like about that book is the cover art.
Well, the internal layout is pretty rough too.
73, at least this.
Yeah, 72, 73.
Yeah, 73.
So
Dr. Pipa mentioned on this program that book really was freed the consciences of many men to join the PCA, to realize that this is not schismatic, that it is time.
And Dr. Smith mentions in the preface to that when he began work on that project, he was not convinced yet that it was time to leave. But by the time he finished his close examination of the constitutional actions of the PCUS through the mid-20th century, he determined that he could not in good conscience remain in the PCUS. And so it was definitely an important project that he took on, as dry as it is for reading today.
I mean, it's basically a summary of like minutes, right? But it's showing you read through it, and it still is pretty shocking to be like, whoa, they did that, and it's just time after time. So
it was one of our required textbooks.
Yeah, and for anyone who's not familiar,
and I think
with
it was for quite a while.
Yeah. For anyone not familiar with it, the first 219 pages or so are his narrative, and then the latter are all the judicial cases and the documentation for everything that he's argued in the narrative. So it's it's quite a feat. But there he is, and he's chosen, elected to be the first stated clerk of the PCA, 1973, December 4th. By the way, we just passed an anniversary of the first General Assembly, December the 4th, in Birmingham, and then serves as stated clerk. Retires from that. 5 years in the making, and he's once again recruited and becomes a consultant for a bunch of ruling elders who want to start a seminary in South Carolina to provide a regional seminary for men to go into the ministry, particularly in the PCA. And Dr. Smith once again ends up being at the founding of a seminary. And along with Dr. Smith is one of his buddies who was also involved back in Mississippi at Belhaven and at RTS briefly, and that was Dr. Greg Singer. Until Dr. Singer's death in '99, he taught at Greenville Seminary, and then went to be with the Lord. So, and I didn't mention earlier, I was just reminded, I've been looking over a couple of books from Jack Scott, back to the RTS days, Belhaven and then RTS. Jack Scott was a remarkable figure in those early days, teaching at RTS Jackson and Belhaven before that. But his little book on wisdom literature and his little book on the God's plan unfolded, which is a big sweeping biblical theological treatment at a popular level. He wrote for years for the curriculum for the PCUS until he was out of vogue, and then in the PC early days, and we kept his books through the Great Commission publications in print for many years. Sadly, they've dropped off the radar now. But
Dr. Wilborn, let me chime in on that. Ryan and I were just at the PCA bookstore, and I noticed a bunch of Jack Brown Scott books with new covers. And I was speaking to the woman there who was helping us, and she said that they're redoing all of them. And so I think they're keeping them in circulation. I was surprised. I was pleasantly surprised about that.
Because we've used the Wise Otherwise, which is the wisdom literature book, that we do for our youth curriculum at Covenant. And we do that book every fall semester every 3 years. That way, kids who come through junior high and high school work through Wise and Otherwise twice before they graduate from high school at Covenant. And the last few times, we've not been able to get access to any of them, and they told me they had dropped them off the publications. But maybe my nagging has proved beneficial. You never know. But that's moving backwards. Let's move forward. So 1987, and Dr. Smith taught from 1987 until until he turned 90 at Greenville Seminary. The last 3 years was teaching just one course, his Intro to Reformed Faith, or Intro to Reformed Theology course. And he would drive down from Brevard and teach. And but during those 10 years, many sunny and rainy afternoons after a class, he would come, peck on the door, and come into my study at the seminary, and we would sit and talk. And right up until the day he finished at the seminary, whenever he'd come in, he'd say, "So what are you reading?" And so I'd say, "Well, here's what I'm reading." "Oh, okay. I haven't seen that one." And I'd say, well, here, take it home. And no, you finish it and then I'll take it. And so I would finish it and he would take it, and he'd bring it back and we'd talk about it. And even until up until the time, just a few months before his stroke, which precipitated his death by just a few weeks, well, a couple of weeks really. Every time I'd go see him, I'd take him something. I'd say, here's what I just finished reading. You want to read it? Well, sure. And then we'd talk about it on the phone or in person when I'd go up there to see him. And so he stayed very active in the literature, not nearly like he had, in his younger days, but still very, very aware of what was being published and reading as much as he possibly could. Now I'll tell you a cute story. I and a friend, one of his younger colleagues in what was then the Western Carolina Presbyterian, were going to see him one day. This was, he was 90. Let's see, 92. He was 92. As it turns out, we were there, and I learned this as just a couple of days before I went. I realized I was going to be going to see him on his 72nd wedding anniversary, and so my wife sent some cards, some little thank you cards that she had made for Miss Lois, a little gift, and on the way through, I had him a gift already, and this friend of mine I picked up in Asheville, and we were going, and I told him what the occasion was. He said, "Oh, I didn't bring anything." I said, "Well, we'll stop at Ingalls as we get into Brevard, and we'll let you pick him up a 12-pack of Diet Cokes." And okay. And now Roland will remember that Dr. Smith was seldom ever seen around the seminary without a Coke in his hand. And I never saw him drink anything at a meal other than Coca-Cola until he was about 85. And the doctor said, "You know what? Your sugar is getting on up there. Maybe you need to cut out the Cokes." And so he went to Coke Zero, or Diet Coke. And so my friend got him a 12-pack of Diet Coke, and I got a bundle of flowers and put them with the gift Carol had sent, and we went on. And so while we were there at the Ingalls in Brevard, I said, I better call and be sure they haven't forgotten. I mean, they were 92. And I said, I want to be sure they haven't forgotten that we're coming, because it's a gated community and we got to be sure and be able to get in. So I called. Dr. Smith answered. Now, I don't know how this worked, because I was there when the phone rang and they would answer, but it seemed like every time I would call, Lois could hear everything that was going on from another room. And so she would end up talking to me down the hallway. And it was this hollow sound. So anyway, Dr. Smith answers the phone and he said, "Oh, yeah, well, I didn't tell him where we were. I didn't tell him we were virtually there. I just said, I just want to check and be sure today's still a good day." He said, "Well, it maybe not. Lois is in a malaise today." And I hear from down the hall, "Morton Smith, I know what malaise is, and I don't have it. I'm an old woman, and sometimes I just don't feel good." let me talk to Nick. All right. So the phone, I hear movement. Nick, hey, you need to come on and see Morton. I said, well, yes, ma'am. So here, Morton. So Morton took the phone back and I said, did you hear that, Dr. Smith? He said, yeah, you better come on. And so we did. And we had a grand visit and took them their presents. And I learned a new word that day, malaise. And so, and she wasn't in the throes of malaise. She was just an old woman with arthritis, and she didn't feel good. But as it turns out, he was suffering from some melancholy, as the reformers would call it. So that's a cute little story to throw in. But that's the relationship that Morton and Lois had. They were cute as they could be with one another all through the years that I knew them, and up until the end. Just remarkable couple. Well, I've lingered on this too long because y'all want to talk about
Well,
other things.
yeah. Well, no, thank you. That's wonderful background. I want to play about 5 or 6 minutes of an address by Dr. Smith from the Spring Theology Conference. But before I do, any comments from our panel here?
Two details I want to throw in here, both of which I've learned from Dr. Pipa, who is one of Dr. Smith's students. Actually, maybe three details. The first detail is during his service to our country during World War II, Dr. Smith desperately wanted to fly combat missions, but he was told by his superiors, his commanding officers, Mr. Smith, we cannot have you do that. You're too valuable as an instructor. And I see in that a perfect analogy for what ended up being his service to the church for many decades. He wanted to be a local church pastor. His initial call was to a yoked call, two small struggling churches that couldn't afford a minister on their own. And so they partnered together to call him into the field. And it was very soon after he got there that he was then called down to Belhaven to teach. And for the rest of his ministerial career, he was a teacher and an administrator, a stated clerk, really equipping others, coaching others, training others to go into the front lines of ministry. And oh, how useful he was in that. And so you see how his commanding officer, Christ, kept him in a very similar role to his commanding officer, as his commanding officers did during World War II. So that's one detail. Another detail that came to mind as Dr. Wilborn was speaking is, yes, Cornelius Van Til really encouraged Dr. Smith to go back into the PCUS and to return to Columbia Seminary so as to be of use to the PCUS. But it was also, I think, William McElwain, a PCUS missionary to Japan, who decisively persuaded Dr. Smith to pursue reform in the Southern Church rather than to jump ship into what was still a small, largely northern OPC. And that just speaks to just how much Dr. Smith loved the Southern Church, but even also how much he was very, very close himself to pursuing ministry opportunities in the OPC because of how intellectually stimulating his time at Westminster had been and his affinities for the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. Indeed, even that little church in Valdosta, Georgia, that he helped to get started as a student at Columbia, ended up choosing to pursue or to be particularized in the OPC rather than in the PCUS. And so that's an interesting historical detail. The third one is from the end of his life. As I mentioned, Dr. Wilborn and I visited with Dr. Smith in August of 2017. I think I had one more phone conversation with Dr. Smith before his stroke. The day before his stroke, Dr. Pipa, a couple students, and a board member, Mr. Frank Adderholt, and another board member, Dr. Kevin Backus of the Bible Presbyterian Church, visited with Dr. Smith in his home. The next day he had the stroke. And then Dr. Pipa and I went up to visit him in the hospital. I remember Dr. Pipa came to my office and said, "Hey, son, you want to go up to Brevard with me to visit Dr. Smith?" And I said, "In the hospital?" "Yeah." I said, "You want to take me to do a hospital visit with Dr. Smith?" "Yeah, come on. If you can." I said, "Yeah, absolutely. I'll go." While we were there, Dr. Piper read a passage of scripture from the servant songs. I think it was Isaiah 40 or 42. It was in there. It was one of Dr. Smith's favorite passages that Dr. Piper had remembered. And Dr. Smith responded, and we could tell that he could hear what was being said, even though he couldn't verbalize a response at that point after his stroke. But I was privileged to be present for that particular visit. And Dr. Smith really did have a love for God's word, and particularly for those last chapters of Isaiah, and how powerfully and clearly they speak to Christ. And even while listening to him lecturing on that portion of Isaiah while mowing my lawn, that he made an application, said, "You could use this passage to refute Jehovah's Witnesses and all those who claim Christ is not fully God." And as I was listening to that, pushing my lawnmower, I saw my neighbor getting evangelized by Jehovah's Witnesses. And so Dr. Smith, through his recorded lecture, basically said to me, "You need to go and talk to that neighbor after those Jehovah's Witnesses get out of there." And I did, and I still am in relationship with that guy. And he did not become a Jehovah's Witness, thankfully. I've been sharing the gospel with him now for a couple years. But anyway, I'm very thankful for Dr. Smith and his ministry. Just wanted to add a little bit of color to the narrative there.
Well,
Yeah, let me add. Is that all right? Just, as someone who never met Dr. Smith, it stands out to me just the breadth of his influence. As I read PCUS history or early PCA history, and just, obviously he was the first stated clerk, but his influence at RTS, 1964, he starts teaching, and then I think the seminary is formalized as a seminary in 1966. But and even from what I understand, he was, training them in, pretty conservative Reformed theology, more subscriptional approach, and so that was even important. I know the early PCA wasn't entirely united there, but he was behind a lot of that, which I think is a good thing. And so you've got that, so RTS, also Greenville. those are, two of the important seminaries influencing, not only the PCA, other seminary, Presbyterian denominations as well. So, just the fact that he had his hand in both of those, I think, is impressive. The other thing is his writings, and just again, the breadth of the things he covers. So he not only has, maybe we can talk about these more after the video, Ryan, but not only does he have his dissertation on the studies in Southern Presbyterianism, which is, I think, fairly unique, but then he's got he did a systematic theology. He's got his commentary on the BCO. He's got books. The history of the decline of the PCUS. So just and then booklets on subscription and the regulative principle. So all of these things that are just very important for Reformed theology, American Presbyterianism, and he had his hands in everything. And so so he's influenced me. I'm someone who never studied under him, but just trying to track some of his books down. I wish some of them were a little more available online. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But yes, that just stands out to me about Dr. Smith.
I'll just add real quick, Ryan, because I know you want to play that clip, but just being his student for 5 years, I didn't have classes with him every year that I was a student, but he was around. He was always very warm and encouraging, and he was always available to you if you had a question or if you had a criticism. A godly criticism of some point of doctrine. He would receive his students well, and he treated them well. I remember he would give oral examinations, and in one of the classes I had, when I think it was prolegomena, he asked me the question. He said, "Mr. Matthews, what is the principle of being?" And I thought, all right, this is right up my alley. I'm so excited. And so as soon as I start to talk, I'm sitting in front of Dr. Smith, and I realize the breadth of his knowledge, and I just froze. And I said, "God?" And that was it. And he just sits there, he smiles, he goes, "Huh, could you expand on that a little bit?" so he didn't knock me down. He didn't criticize me. He just sort of took it in stride. He could see probably that I was nervous, and just encouraged me to expand on it. And I got my footing, and then we started talking again. But that's how he was. From the moment I first met him, he was welcoming and inviting, friendly. From the moment I left the seminary, he was always a great encouragement and a blessing.
I'll add one more thing. If I think because of his love for the Southern Church and the theologians of the Southern Church, a lot of people miss the point that he was rather eclectic in his. Well, let me just illustrate. If you read, Zach mentioned his systematic theology, the 2 volumes. Yeah, Zach Garish. And when you read that, you realize that he drew from Calvin, and he drew from the Dutch, and he drew from the Scots and the English. He was, and he drew it all together to produce that, what were his lecture notes and the systematic theology. He wasn't, you didn't just get a dose of, Thornwell in Prolegomena, and then in soteriology, and then it was the whole gamut of Reformed scholarship, and a lot of that, particularly the Dutch. He was reading out of the original because he had studied in Amsterdam and knew Dutch, and he once said to me, he said, I'd always grown up in Virginia, and I'd heard about the Dutch and how that if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much, and said, I just thought that was something Southerners said about them. But then I got up there to the University of Michigan, and I realized, because my name wasn't Von Smith, that I wasn't much. And yeah, that's another. He had a wonderful sense of humor, and it was rather understated because he was so quiet. But he did have a good sense of humor. But I'd hate for anybody to miss, as we finished, whenever we finish tonight, that he was eclectic in his reading and in his appreciation for theology. He drew very widely, and back to Roland's point about things he knew, it came from everywhere. He wasn't limited in that sense.
Mm. Well, as we kind of transition into discussing his theology and more particular contributions to the PCA, I want to play this video from, I think it's the 1999 spring theology lecture from Greenville Seminary. There's 2 different parts of it, so this isn't one stream of thought, but just a couple of segments. It's about 5 minutes where he emphasizes the importance of old school Presbyterian thought, which is probably what he is most remembered for as one of the distinctives. So here is Morton Smith.
Now, the doctrinal divisions of the New England theology. Despite the fact of this breakdown of Presbyterian order and polity, the more important matter of concern was the fact that New England theology there had arisen in New England. A new theology had arisen, which was no longer true to the Reformed faith of the Westminster Standards. Dr. B.M. Palmer, in his biography of Thornwell, devotes a chapter to the old school, new school split. He observes, in the history of the church, laxity in doctrine is always sure to accompany contempt of discipline and order. That's a thing I think, again, we need to remember. Laxity of doctrine will accompany laxity or contempt for discipline and order. He further asserts regarding the old school, new school controversy, the cardinal issue in the whole dispute was that of strict or lax construction of the acknowledged standards. Now, George Marsden, and we don't have time to get into his analysis particularly, he points out and he feels that the Bible Presbyterian Church and the RPCES that joined the PCA really is part of that main heritage, is a descendant of the New School. And that's interesting to see. I would maintain that way may well be the case, but that also liberalism of the Charles Augustus Briggs type comes out of the New School. And that, in other words, you have deviation from solid, sound Presbyterianism and Reformed theology of the Westminster Standards, and you have either going to fundamentalism type of thing that the Bible Presbyterians at least at first seem to hold, or you have going off to the left in the opposite direction, the Briggs and the radical liberalism that resulted from the Briggs case of Union Seminary separating from the Presbyterian Church and so forth. Now, the Southern Presbyterian Church, I think we should see this. The Southern Presbyterian Church, following the division, continued to be primarily old school. You had small groups in the South that were new school. In 1864, I believe it was, that they finally re-emerged. And here, rather interestingly, and I have it in my doctoral dissertation, the debate with Dabney, and actually calling him in question as to his theological position, in which he had chaired a committee for the union of the old and new school in the South. And what Dabney wanted to do is to bring these people back into the old school church and suppress their voice. And Palmer really objected to this and didn't think it was good, and then accused him of deviating from sound theology, which Dabney protested before the assembly that he was not doing. But after that union, which has been basically on old school terms, the Northern Church rejoined in 1869, and the Southern Church, in response to invitations to enter into union in 1870, said both wings, or the reunion shall be, the both wings of the now united assembly, old and new school assemblies being united in 1869 in the North, during their separate existence before the fusion, did fatally complicate themselves with the state in political utterances, deliberately pronounced year after year, in which in our judgment were a sad betrayal of the cause of the kingdom and of our common Lord and head. We believe it to be solemnly incumbent upon the Northern Church, not with reference to us, but before the Christian world and before our divine Master and King, to purge itself of this error. So they refused they wanted the Northern Church to admit that they had been involved in political actions and so forth. And then they described the union. The union now consummated between the old and new school assemblies north was accomplished by methods which, in our judgment, involve a total surrender of all the great testimonies of the church for the fundamental doctrines of grace at time when the victory of the truth over error hung long in the balance. The united assembly stands of necessity upon an allowed latitude of interpretation of standards, and must come at length to embrace nearly all shades of doctrinal belief. Isn't that prophetic? That's exactly what happened in the Northern Church. Of those falling testimonies, we, Southern Presbyterians, are now the sole surviving error, which we must lift from the dust and bear to the generations after us. If we would be if it would be a serious compromise of this sacred trust to enter into public and official fellowship with those repudiating these testimonies, and to do this expressly upon the ground as stated in the preamble to the overture before us, that the terms of reunion between the two branches of the Presbyterian Church of the North, now happily consummated, present an auspicious opportunity for adjustment of such relations. To found such correspondence professedly upon this idea would be to endorse that which we thoroughly disapprove. The Northern Church never responded to that, but that was the position of the Southern Church. She saw herself clearly as an old school church. And essentially, it is my thesis that that's what we were seeking to do as we formed the PCA. We called ourselves Continuing Presbyterian Church. And what were we talking about? Not continuing of the Southern Presbyterian Church as it was in the 1960s or the 1940s or the 1930s, but of the 1860s and 70s and 80s, the old school Presbyterian Church.
Well, there you have a testimony from our PCA founding father on the importance of being old school, the danger of doctrinal laxity, as well as the vision of those PCA founding fathers, that the continuing Presbyterian Church would be an old school denomination, continuing in that tradition. Well, what are your thoughts on Dr. Smith, on his legacy now?
Well, that comment there on the old school, new school, that stuff's always interesting, because the Southern Church charged the Northern Church with doctrinal laxity, and they maintained that even though you had the old school, new school unite in the North there, though Charles Hodge basically predicted that they would be lax at some point, and I think that proved to be correct. The Southern New School, that's just really interesting stuff he says about Dabney. You can go read on all of that. Dabney was trying to unite the South, and though his views on universal satisfaction of Christ, I think, was somewhat in line with the Southern New School, which is partly why I think he was fine just bringing them on board, and they were more conservative, I think, than the Northern New School. But yeah, I mean, this is what's great is you can go read, Dr. Smith on all this stuff. Fascinating. And maybe this is even good to mention, get Dr. Wilborn's thoughts, is there's not a lot of modern literature on some of these issues. I mean, Dr. Smith, his dissertation was 1962, Studies in Southern Presbyterianism. And I know we have E.T. Thompson, who was actually a liberal in the PCUS. We have his 3-volume what is it? History? No, it's Presbyterians in the South. That's the volume. It's 3-volume history, and the last one was 1970. But it's interesting. We don't have a lot of broad works like those anymore. I think, as far as I know, those are the last ones of entire books. We have essays and the like, but yeah. So it's just it's interesting to hear Dr. Smith comment on all of those things.
Yeah, I think Dr. Dabney's intent in trying to bring the new school in was also to prevent them from founding an educational institution, that just bring them in, we'll consume them, and they won't be able to dominate they won't be able to propagate, essentially.
No, that's right. And but he was opposed, and Zach is right that Palmer particularly was not in favor of it. That was a complicated situation from the get-go, because the Southern New School was never doctrinally what the Northern New School was. They had their own reasons for being part of that movement, and some of them we might even be a little sympathetic to, because of the way the old school men dealt with the new school men in the General Assembly setting that created the two churches in 1837.
It was more ecclesiastical, wasn't it? They
Yeah.
just didn't like the high-handedness of
Yeah.
the new school or the old school.
But because of those 20 years plus of being out of the old school context, I'm talking about the Southern New School, the United Synod of the South. Because of those 20 plus years of being out away from the old school influence and the, if you will, the leavening and uh, the the guardianship of old school thinkers. Uh, they certainly, and if you can find this, they'd certainly drifted theologically, and but the ultimate issue is I guess it was Zach Groff said, the guy down there, um, yeah, the founding of, or maybe Ryan did, I don't know. It's late, but yeah, the founding of the theological institution was a major concern to Dabney, and he was greatly concerned that if they get this thing going, they can propagate any variants that they're teaching, and then we've really got problems across the Southland. So that was an issue.
Maybe this is a good good segue into this, just the topic of subscription, because that I think that just based on his writings, that was essential matter to Dr. Smith. He's got. I tried to grab some books off the shelf here. I think I have two different books on subscription, and they're short. The Subscription Debate, and then Holding Fast to the Faith, particular history of subscription to creeds and confessions, with particular reference to the Presbyterian churches. That one I think is a little more recent. So I know he's on the side of arguing the Adopting Act of 1729, where the Presbyterian Church in the United States, well, that was where they were colonies, but they adopted the Westminster Standards. Well, actually, I think it was just the Confession at first. The Catechism's not until 1789, I think. So anyway, there's disagreement today over how strict of subscription the Adopting Act was. Dr. Smith argues for strict subscription. There's the other side that argues that no, there was allowing for some exceptions and whatnot. But regardless of the historical debate, I think there still is the practical debate, and that and that's what he does in his writings, is often arguing that the churches that don't take subscription as seriously, they tend to drift, and so that's even obviously a relevant issue even in the PCA, where we kind of have standard exceptions that presbyteries allow, or even things that maybe deviate from the standards that we don't even rule as exceptions anymore. So I want to just open up the whole topic, I think, because it's definitely something that Dr. Smith spoke to in his writings, and I assume he did as well in the classroom.
It's really not a complicated concept at all. If you try to get an orchestra together and you want to play a particular symphony, and you give the trombonists Beethoven's Fifth, and you give the violinists Dvorak's Fourth, and you give the cellists Mendelssohn's Third, and each section has a different symphony in front of it, and they all start to play, the conductor's going to fall over and die of cardiac arrest, because it's going to sound terrible, but they're not going to be able to accomplish anything. And full subscription is simply just saying, guys, let's all play from the same sheet of music. We all got to be on the same page here. To change the analogies to maybe something that's a bit more realistic here, if you go to work for a public school district as a teacher, and they say, okay,
Are you recommending this, Zach?
I am not recommending this. If you go work, but you're going to see why I'm putting this out here. If you go and work for the government schools, and they say this is a curriculum you need to teach, and you say, oh, great, thank you. This is a good start. Let me go through it. Give me a couple weeks. All right, fine. A couple weeks later, you come back and say, this is by and large, I'm okay teaching this, but this unit here, I actually take a different view. I learned from my college professor at such and such state university in the education department, who had a completely different view. So I'm going to adjust that, and I'm going to adjust this, and da, 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 da. And the principal says, I gave you the curriculum that you need to teach. And if you can't teach it, you can teach elsewhere. You can find a school that will allow you to teach what you want to teach. When we, as presbyteries...
But wouldn't that violate academic freedom, though, Zach?
There is no such thing in the government schools. Come on. The point of the analogy is this. A guy comes into our presbyteries. We say, we are the Presbyterian Church in America. We subscribe as a church to this published form of doctrine, the Westminster Confession of Faith, together with a larger and shorter catechism as adopted by this church in 1973. This is our curriculum. And you respond and say, hey, that's great. I have a few differences, and they're actually pretty significant. They're more than just semantic. It's not just, doesn't just have to do with the wording. It has to do with the substance on this, and this point. Our response has become, okay, well, let's think through this and see if they're acceptable or not. Okay, you can hold to those, but you mustn't teach them, or you can hold to them and you can teach them, but you have to do so alongside of what we publish to the world as well. So you could teach the heterodoxy along with what we consider to be orthodoxy. When really our response should be what the public school district's response would be. And that is, that's fine. You can go find a different institution in which you will be free to teach those things. But here we have a set curriculum. I don't see why we as presbyteries have to be so skittish about exercising doctrinal standards up here. Instead, we've kind of defanged ourselves, so to speak, or declawed ourselves so that we're even weaker than public school districts in terms of setting a uniform curriculum, which, not only our churches must teach, but the people who come to our churches can expect to receive. And I think that's an important point that gets missed. But, this is not a complex issue. Maybe my analogies actually made it out to be more complex than it is. It's just a matter of, are we publishing to the world what we believe the scriptures to be teaching? Are we publishing with one voice, or are we publishing a confusing cacophony of voices?
I think to that point, Zach, when we talk about system subscription, the question is, what does that mean exactly? And in relation to the idea of good faith subscription, what does that mean anymore? It seems to me that oftentimes good faith subscription sort of collapses into a pick and choose notion of system subscription. Looks like this. The system is somewhere in the Westminster Confession, somewhere in the Westminster Standards, and I'm going to believe this part of it here, but I'm not going to believe this part of it. This isn't part of the system that I hold to, that I think the Bible teaches. Whereas I think, maybe I'm wrong on this, Garris, you can correct me. System subscription is saying the Westminster Standards is the system of doctrine contained in the scripture, insofar as we understand it. So it's not that the Westminster Standards contain it within it somewhere in an amorphous way, but is identical with it. Is that correct? And so when
that sounds right.
Ferreting out those two positions will give greater clarity, I think, to our courts, because most people are operating on the assumption that to say the Westminster Standards contains the system of doctrine means that it's somewhere in these words, but it's not identical with all the words.
Yeah, but let me add. Go ahead, BZ.
I mean, I don't agree with that, by the way. I'm just.
Well,
Trying.
I think that when we say that the Westminster Standards contain the system, they're parroting the language of the confession when it refers to the Holy Scriptures contain. So that the Westminster Standards exhaust the system.
Mhm.
So system subscription, though, as I understand it, is there is a system within the Westminster Standards, and we're not going to tell you what it is. We don't know what it is. It's sort of undefined. And the only way we can know what that system is when someone brings his differences, and then we kind of decide, is he subscribing to the system? I don't know, because when we say system subscription, or even good faith subscription, those words, those phrases aren't defined by our Constitution. So what system subscription or good faith subscription means in Tennessee Valley Presbytery might be different than in Blue Ridge Presbytery. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, that the presbytery, as the fundamental court of our system, has the right to determine that. But
Well, we do
when
we do have
speak
some.
of,
I was just going to say we do have some. The BCO does say, if it strikes at the vitals or hostile to the
Right.
system. Again, though, I think part of the problem is those words aren't
defined.
defined, and so you always go back to, it ends up being somewhat subjective, and it's up to the presbytery. But that's where I think the whole Sabbath issue is. That's always a big one that stands out to me, because it's not just some isolated issue. The Sabbath's pretty big within the standards. And then, but we have all sorts of variants of views and practices and exceptions within the PCA. And I at least find that one fascinating, because when you go look at the earlier history, I don't think guys were taking exceptions on the Sabbath. I think that's a pretty modern thing. And maybe Dr. Wilborn can comment more on that. But that strikes me as kind of ironic. This is like appears to be a recent innovation, is let's all just, throw out the Sabbath. I mean, even the Methodists and Baptist, everybody was a Sabbatarian.
The Methodist Book of Discipline, even until 2018, and maybe past that, but that's the last time I checked, talked about the Lord's Day as the Christian Sabbath, very similar to what what Westminster would say. I want to read from
Thomas Jefferson was a Sabbatarian, so there you go. I mean, come on.
Yeah. But it really was the latter part of the 20th century when Protestants decided that the Lord's Day was no longer the Christian Sabbath. Dr. Wilborn, could you provide any historical background? I keep putting you on the spot tonight, but you did get that PhD in history, so you earned it.
Well, I was looking actually for something I thought I could lay my hands on pretty quickly here on my little iPad, but I'm and it's on the system subscription. Let me see if I think I'm close. When we had the ongoing debates that eventually landed with in the PCA I'm talking about, that landed with what we now call good faith subscription. And that term is not novel to us. It was a term that was used by earlier generations. But I remember at one General Assembly, in fact, I guess it was the assembly the year that we then made the vote and to amend our Constitution to this good faith subscription. Then it went out to the presbyteries. It was voted, of course, and the next year it was constitutionalized. We had in the pre-assembly, it was different than it is now, but we had a series of papers given on subscription. And if my memory is right, Dr. Pipa did one. Dr. David Coffin, before he was a doctor, gave one. It was very similar to Dr. Pipa's. Tim Keller, the late Tim Keller, gave one, and Brian Chappell gave one of the papers. And Dr. Chappell, actually basically gave the definition of what what we would mean by this, because it was what the RPCS had meant by it. He didn't say that, but that's what he wasn't making up something. He was being true to his heritage. And George Hutchinson summarizes it here, um, quoting from the Synod of 1961, which was meant, and I'm quoting Hutchinson, which, by the way, this comes from his volume on the history of the RPCES, which is a wonderfully well written history that gives you a good early history in Scotland over to the States, those early periods, and then largely the history of the Bible Presbyterian Church to the division within the Bible Church, the union with the Reformed Church, and what became the RPCS before joining and receiving with us. Is this meant to define what system of doctrine means? And this is what the answer that the Synod gave and was adopted. We hold our standards as a whole set forth the system of doctrine of our faith, and we deem as essential those doctrines of the Christian faith without which one cannot have a consistent biblical and Calvinistic confession, such as those pertaining to the nature of and the sovereignty of God and his revelation and the continuity of one covenant of God. For example, the doctrines of the inerrancy of scriptures, the virgin birth of Christ, the substitutionary atonement, the miracles of Christ, the resurrection of Christ as defended by our parent Presbyterian body in 1910, 1916, 1923. And any other doctrine which in the judgment of the church, and this gets into what you just said with, now the presbyteries have to make decisions, and they built it into their statement here. Any other doctrine which in the judgment of the church would undermine such essential doctrines, and the essential doctrines were the 5-point declaration. So anything that might undermine those should be regarded as against the system of doctrine. So in essence, the system of doctrine for the RPCS was the 5-point declaration under the big umbrella of the sovereignty of God and God having revealed to us truth, the revelation of God. So it's not quite as nebulous as it seems. It's pretty narrow, as you see from their own documents.
And that seems to be what we're seeing.
Yeah, it's helpful to know that, so you kind of know what you're working with. I think that's largely what we have a large, well, when you start many, I don't know if it's most or many in the PCA, but that seems to be the grid through which many people in the PCA are working, is that limited, that very narrow understanding of what it is we believe is essential to our system of doctrine.
And that creates a confession within a confession, that, well, this is what we say we believe, but this is what we really believe, and which is deeply problematic. And we're seeing the results of that attitude toward the confession now, disturbing the peace of the PCA. But
then you're back to something Dr. Smith said in that clip, and that is, it's one thing to say and maintain faithfully those things that I just read, but laxity in doctrine is something else. And that gets into the question of the Sabbath and, all the things we're starting to see people parade. And as you fellows probably know in your presbyteries, I know we see it in our presbytery. It's not just what you do or don't do on the Lord's Day, but is there a Lord's Day? And if so, which one is it? Which day is it? And we're hearing men saying, well, I don't, I'll just say something I've heard said. Since I work on the Lord's Day, preaching, leading worship, my Sabbath is Monday. I mean, I've heard that in more than one presbytery in the PCA. And now you're talking something different than system subscription, right?
Yeah.
Now
There's
you're
no moral
talking,
law.
now you're talking laxity in doctrine, which leads to, Dr. Smith said, laxity in order and discipline. And so.
Because that's
Wilson,
also taking
then,
the view that the Sabbath is just a rest and not it's detaching it from worship, which is why we believe it's on Sunday, right? So
yeah.
Wilson Van Hooser, in his Gospel Gazing podcast in a couple of weeks, has an episode dedicated to the Sabbath, which is, I think, a pretty good one. Matthew Lee is on there. Ruling Elder offers great insights. I was privileged to get to listen to some of Matthew Lee's comments, and profoundly grateful to be part of that conversation. But yeah, we are seeing an abdication of the Sabbath, and it's just a silly thing for a preacher to say my Sabbath is on Monday. I mean, if anything, you want your Sabbath to be on Friday so that you get 2 days off in a row, right? Why would you take it on Monday? You got all these phone calls to catch up on by Monday. No, but yeah, you're right, Zach. That does betray a lack of understanding of the worshipfulness that's integral to the
I've
Sabbath,
always known
both
you
the
were
Old
a
and New Covenant.
pragmatist at heart, Brian.
I'm just a new school pragmatist. That's you heard it here, folks.
He's from Ohio or St. Louis or something like that.
Ohio or St. Louis, yeah, or Utah or something.
Playing with the day that way also diminishes the fundamental eschatological structure of the Sabbath. Voss refers to the Sabbath as, in essence, the organizing principle of redemptive history. It's the kernel, the essence of the covenant of works. It finds no fulfillment until Christ, as it were. And it's only when that occurs that the seventh-day Sabbath is transformed. Now, you would say there's an eschatological rest that yet remains. I know there's a lot of debate about what that means, but for confessional men, what it means is that we reenact that great Sabbath entry each Sunday and look forward to the great Sabbath rest that's on the horizon. But when you say that the day can be any day and it's just a matter of cessation of work, you lose sight of the fundamental structure movement of redemptive history from creation to its consummation in Christ. And I think that's a biblical theological travesty to lose that.
Yeah.
Not least the confessional one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what Dr. Smith, I think, tried to do was pull the denomination in a direction of strict full subscription and old school Southern Presbyterianism. That was
Brian.
That was one of the
Oh, go ahead and finish. Yeah. So. Oh, I was just gonna say, with Dr. Smith, I know it's getting late, so everybody's probably getting tired. See, I'm out on the West Coast. Well, not the coast, but Mountain Time. So it's not too bad. It's not too bad for me out here. So at least I think one thing we should say before we finish up, or before any of you guys fall asleep on me, is that I think it's unfortunate what happened. I believe it was 2018 where they didn't give Dr. Smith a memorial, and my understanding was something passed so that we don't do memorials at all.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay.
Correct.
So I mean, I think that's just really sad. I mean, not just for Dr. Smith, but what about like R.C. Sproul? So he didn't get one. Is that correct?
Correct.
I'm trying to remember what year he died. Yeah, same year.
Yeah, it was all the same year.
So this is just, I mean, I think that's kind of ridiculous, but and it seems like, I mean, I at least know why people don't like Dr. Smith, but I think this is just a problem generally with looking back at men of the past. Is okay, we want to say we disagree with them on like the racial views or whatever. But we're going to find one thing. It's a hot topic, always race or slavery or whatever back in the day. And so we're going to cancel that guy. That's effectively what's going on, is we're going to cancel somebody over something that we disagree with today. And I think this is unchristian behavior. So I'm going to say something very bold here. I think it's unchristian behavior. I think it's intellectually immature. You don't do that with people. Oh, I disagree with them on something, so I'm going to cancel them, act like they had nothing good. I mean, I don't even do that with people I, maybe strongly disagree with on a lot of things. I mean, I can find, some, that's what I think we should try to do, at least try to find the good from, especially from other Christians. I mean, that's a big thing, other Christians. But I would even say appeal to the fifth commandment here, which is honor your father and mother. But I think that certainly applies more broadly, which would include even spiritual fathers. I mean, plenty of men in the Bible were sinful. It doesn't mean you dishonor them. Was Abraham perfect? David? I mean, come on. So who cares? I don't really care what the sin is. Every man has their faults. And Dr. Smith is worthy of honor, as were the Presbyterians of old, 19th century Presbyterians, whether it's Hodge, Dabney, whoever. You disagree with stuff, I don't care. You should honor those men and learn what you can from them. And you don't just dismiss them. I think that's just an unchristian attitude.
Well, Zach, I agree with you on that. Dr. Smith is a complicated figure for a number of reasons. He was not a strong personality, but he certainly had the courage of his convictions. And even when it was impolitic to hold to certain of those convictions, and as I'm preparing a piece for publication on the history of the PCA, it's evident that, as stated clerk, Dr. Smith was very fair to everybody, but he also made sure to keep in front of the assembly a very unpopular effort to constitutionalize the Directory for Public Worship. And that irritated some guys. That was not a political move by him. I mean, as stated clerk, he was responsible to do that, but there are certain men that certainly would have preferred Dr. Smith to just let that effort die a quiet, unseen death and move on for the PCA. And Dr. Smith was not willing to do that because it would have been a denial of just basic integrity. And there are other things like that where he had the courage of his convictions in the courts of the church and whatever the political fallout was. But also even, he has things in publication from the 60s that are very unpopular today on matters pertaining to racial relations and segregation, mixture of the races and things like that. And though in private conversation, he has given clarifying remarks and even recanted some of what he said and how he said it, but he never really published anything to address concerns that folks had on some of those views. And so he's a complex figure, but I want to echo what you said. he's still worthy of honor. He never showed malice or hatred to anybody. He never shut anybody down. He was not partial in his dealings. Greenville Seminary has had men of mixed race, two of whom are on this show as students. Roland and I both, students at the seminary. Dr. Smith loved us like sons, particularly Roland, who had him in class.
He preached in my ordination.
Yeah. I mean, Dr. Smith also, he had Black students at Greenville Seminary who regarded him as a spiritual father and have shared that with me, and have gone on public record to say that, say as much. So, I think some of the concerns about him are based on selective data that's been sensationalized a bit, and that has tarnished his public legacy. But certainly those of us who knew him privately know the caliber of man he was. And it is a shame that our denomination hasn't been able to honor him or recognize his contributions to us in that formal way. Though certainly the PCA has recognized his contributions in other ways. And one founding father, not Dr. Pipa, I feel like I have to give that caveat because I'm so close with Dr. P, but one founding father has said that if the PCA cannot honor Morton Smith, then the PCA can't honor anybody. Because in a certain sense, nobody, humanly speaking, has given his life more to the PCA than Dr. Smith did, particularly in the last 50 years of his life. So I echo what you said, Zach. I think you stated it well, but we do have to acknowledge there's complexity there, just as there is with everybody, and certainly will be with each and every one of us when we're translated to glory. And folks either forget us or remark upon our legacies wherever the Lord has us to serve.
On that point, I thought I would just be quiet on this, but I think perhaps it'll be helpful to some people who may have struggled with Dr. Smith on his view of particularly interracial marriage. And I'm going to be brief on this. I could say more, but it is a late hour. Zach alluded to the students, whether they be from Haiti or countries in Africa, or having lived here in the United States all their life and been of dark complexion, can testify to the fact that he was not a racist. The position he held, and this is where we oversimplify him if we don't acknowledge this, the position he held on the issue of interracial marriage was a theological one. It was not a race-based position. And you can find that same position among men of faith around the world today. It was not a 1960s position. It predates that. It's still with us today. But I think that in a succinct manner, maybe it would help somebody know that it was a theological grounded position, not a racially grounded position. And we can disagree with this theology at that point, and I do, but I'm not then going to turn around and say, well, then he was a racist because of that theological position. So, but anyway, I feel a bit on this topic like the last 2 weeks. I heard even today, as I drove home this evening, at the end of the Paul Feinbaum show on ESPN Extra, another Florida State fan called in to whine about Florida State getting bumped out of the playoffs and the much superior University of Alabama Crimson Tide being placed in the number 4 spot. Ryan said, sitting up there looking all holy because he doesn't care. But this fan had his rant, and then Feinbaum said, well, the fact is, it's a moot point. It's done. It's over. And it's not going to change. And at some point, you have to stay as a dear African American friend of mine in Charleston said one day, concerning some of these sort of things. He said, I think it's about time y'all get over this stuff and get on with the Lord's work. And and I don't mean to say that to sound insensitive to anyone, but particularly with Dr. Smith, he's with the Lord. His position was not a racial position, but it was a theological position that affected his view of interracial marriage, period. And he's not here to debate. So, except, and one last thing to Zach's position. I've said this to young men in Presbyterian exam committee meetings. If you're not really careful, if you start accepting everyone who holds a position contrary to yours, or has a particular sin that you think is particularly heinous, if you start setting them aside, you'll end up being in a corner by yourself, and that makes you out to be God, and we're not. And so you end up not being able to draw on the vast wealth of the work of the Holy Spirit in the history of the church, and it means too that you're forgetting that you too are a sinner. And you stand up on Sunday every week and you preach. And if everybody treated you the way that you treat everyone back here who sinned, no one would be back to hear you preach next week, because you're a sinner. And you just have to be careful. Or else you put yourself in a very isolated position, and that's arrogance.
Yeah, and I think I just amen to that, Dr. Wilborn. It's just like you're studying history. We should be learning from these men. I just think that's the great thing Dr. Smith did, is he was, a lot of his writings he's highlighting, godly theologians of the past and pointing us to their theology. And we can disagree with some things, but I just think part of honoring those who went before us, and different contexts, different failures. That's just all of us. So yeah, I think that's a great perspective you gave.
And it's easy to point to something that a guy wrote in 1960, whatever, articulating his theology. And I've read that. It's been 10 years or so. But then what Zach Groff, the Armenian in the group, pointed out is that men from all nations.
I'm more Arab than I am Armenian. But for those of you who are listening, don't know this, I was with my mom today, so I'm visiting her in Philadelphia. She is about 5 shades darker than I am. She was born in Jordan, about 5'2". My dad was 6'2". He's passed now. Pennsylvania Dutch guy. Obviously different ethnic extractions. And so, I grew up in that kind of context. There's certain difficulties with that. You don't really know, which family am I a part of, more or less or whatever. But at the end of the day, Dr. Smith interacted with me, I think was aware of my background, and it didn't bother him one bit. I mean, it was like nothing. So, just for what it's worth, it might not be much.
So whatever his theology was, in 1962 or 2012, and the way he lived though was that you were a brother in Christ, and that men from all nations regard him as a spiritual father. And I think that is a testimony to the genuineness, to use a postmodern, the word people love to throw around, authenticity, which speaks volumes about his authenticity as a devout man of God. I remember I got to take one class with him, and it was a summer course. So I stayed at the Best Western out there by the Greenville airport, and so intensive course. And I brought my wife with me a couple days, and just the sweetness and the hospitality that this man showed to my wife and I as visiting students. But it was David, King David, who wrote in Psalm 18, "The Lord has dealt with me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands, he rewarded me." And then, David, the murderer, the adulterer, continues, "With the merciful, you show yourself merciful. With the blameless, you show yourself blameless. With the purified, you show yourself pure. And with the crooked, you make yourself seem torturous." And so shouldn't we, as men, as ministers who have benefited beyond what we can express from the ministry of Morton Smith and the personal cost that he bore as he, in many ways, led this denomination, we have benefited from that man's ministry. Shouldn't we be merciful with him? That's just a question for the panel. Should we not show mercy to our fathers in the faith?
Absolutely. Ryan, I was listening to the podcast you did recently with Dr. Pipa and Dr. Robertson and Bebo and Wayne and the brothers. And afterwards, I was reflecting on it, just thinking about the history of the PCA, thinking about Dr. Smith, thinking about others, and thought of the transition from Elijah to Elisha. Elisha asks for a double portion of the Spirit, and he gets it. And I consider what the first generation of the PCA accomplished, what they did in rescuing a church under the superintending grace of the Holy Spirit. This was the Spirit's work, rescuing the Southern Presbyterian Church and a continuing witness therefrom. And I think, man, I don't think we could expect a double portion in our generation now, but I mean, we could barely hold up under that mantle that they've left us. I mean, it really is remarkable what the Lord has done through those men and the motley crew that they were in many ways, as well as they would go on to admit and describe themselves. And I absolutely think that we ought to be merciful and to not explain away or ignore sins where those are clear and evident, but certainly to deal gently with our fathers in the faith, especially as they've passed on.
Yeah, I think let me add just a point there. I think it's fascinating to look back. The PCA breaking off from the PCUS in 1973, and you contrast it, I think, with like the OPC, which was what, 36?
36, yeah.
Yeah. The OPC's, I mean, overall, I think a solid denomination, but it's 30,000 people. The PCA is, for all of our problems, I mean, 400,000 members. It's just kind of wild to look back. That's where the PCA is today. And, for all the problems, I think there are, just the influence the PCA has, and it really can be traced back to men like Dr. Smith. I mean, he was obviously a major player. He wasn't the only one. There's plenty of other founders, but it's just interesting to look back at how Providence works out and where we are today.
Well, anything else? We're approaching 2 hours.
We mustn't forget the men who wrote the BCO for us, because the BCO is for freedom. And Dr. Smith was instrumental in writing the BCO.
Yes. Yeah.
Amen.
I was struck that the Canada family was brought up on this program just now. I was struck that it didn't. That's one of the more significant families in the PCA, and I hope I know that By Faith is going to be producing a 50th anniversary volume. I hope that the legacy of these families is aptly honored by our denomination. We have inherited much, and we have much to be thankful for.
We could almost use a song right now, celebrating the 50th anniversary.
Yeah, Zach.
I left my guitar in South Carolina, and there's not a keyboard here at this Airbnb, so
you can make the RPCNA guys proud and just a cappella.
I could. Yep. Then I could embarrass Dr. Wilborn. Oh, look, he's snapping for me. He's setting a tempo. 98A would go really, really well. Psalm 98A would go really well to that tempo.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for your time tonight. It's been fun.
Hey, thanks you young guys for letting an old guy sit in with you.
Well, we needed
Thanks for being
somebody
willing.
that knew something about something.
I knew what they were talking about.
You should. When you texted and said you were joining, I was kind of like sputtering and stammering when I was trying to tell Ann, oh, Dr. Wilborn said he's coming, and she's just looking at me like, what are you even talking about? She's ready to call, thinking I'm having an attack of some kind. Thanks for coming.
Zach's probably the only one here in this group. Well, Roland too, that would know that I'm a bit of a late owl. I don't sleep much, so 9:20. I figured, hey, how long can they talk? 3 hours. That gets me close to bedtime. Oh,
If we let you keep on going, it would have went for 3 hours.
well, we all know. No, thanks.
All right.
I do appreciate it. It's good to be with y'all.
Yeah. Thanks for this idea, Zach and Zach and Roland. Thank y'all. And Dr. Wilborn, it's a privilege to be on with you. Those of you who are still with us, thanks for persevering to the end.